Hello and welcome to Week 15, the last week in Introduction to Sociology, and cannot imagine a better way to end this particular class than a discussion about social movements. There's probably no time in my life that I haven't, that I've been aware of more social movements that are going on right now. All kinds of people getting together, hopefully socially distancing, but sometimes not, but all of these controversies and stuff, and as disparaging as it sometimes is, you know what it kind of does also, and maybe what we need to keep in mind is that means a lot of people really care about what's going on. And sometimes you may not agree with what they're saying, but at least they're engaged, better than just sitting back. And so hopefully the peaceful discussions continue to happen. And let's take a little look at the sociology of social movements. So here we are in the course book, chapter 21, the last chapter in our course book. And I introduce, a movie about social movements in history and what we have today. And we go into we just sort of did a review a little bit of the forces that change our society. And we've been sort of going through that through the whole class. Started with the, population, urbanization, and technology at the beginning when I talked about the shoemakers. But then we have technology, urbanization, industrialization, social institutions, population, environment, all these things. That means society is a moving thing. It's not something that stays static. It's responsive to changes in people's wants and needs. And sometimes what we're left with is a notion. Well, let me sort of give you an example that I learned when I started working with Apple Computer. I went to a conference once and they talked about whenever there's a change going on, there's sort of three different kinds of people. And they phrased them as flag holders, shark watchers, and speed swimmers. And the scenario was you're on an island and the idea has come that you're going to go to an island, and that represents change. Okay? And when our people are on the island, there's a problem, and then there's a change. There's a potential change, and it's another island. So the characters are characterized as speed swimmers, shark watchers, and flag holders. And the thing is, with an innovative company like Apple, they actually see that all three of these are very important. And you might see these reflected in some of these social movements and the people around you, kind of thing. Okay, let's start talking about them. So we have for one, let me just clarify, this is actually not in the course book because this is actually copyrighted material from Apple. I'm going to seek some permission to put that in there, but maybe for the next time. So, nonetheless, flag holders, individuals that want to keep things the same. They don't want change. They don't see change as being needed. Let's stick with the course. This is what we've been, all of that. Keep in mind, this is an important part of the decision making in order to make a change. Then you have your speed swimmers. These are the individuals like, change? I'm in, and they're jumping in the water. They're going to start swimming to the island. They're ready to go, adventurous, kind of thing. We need them too. We need the risk takers. We need the people right on the cutting edge of technology. And then we have sometimes the more frustrating individuals that we may they're the shark watchers. They're the individuals that are on the shore, and when the speed swimmers jump in, they're the ones that say, you're going to get eaten by sharks. This isn't going to work. Kind of thing. So imagine social movements in that way. Individuals, or let's say there's a change that's going to happen in your family or a change in the workplace. You might be able to identify the flag holders, the people who want to keep things the way they are, the shark watchers who are going to always come up with the negative reasons as to why we shouldn't change. And then there's going to be the speed swimmers that are ready to go. And the negotiation between those three is how the organization grows. So, all that said, let's look at some of the sociology of this. Now, in terms of social movements, we kind of have to put that in the category of collective behavior in terms, and you sort of distinguish social movements from other kinds of gatherings. So we have, first, let's get this idea of category is a group of people that share a characteristic. They don't necessarily have to share a culture, nor do they have to interact with each other. It's just, like I said in the course book, men and women, the different races and different colors and what like that. There might be some cultural things that we can sometimes assume, but we probably shouldn't, associated with race and ethnicity and whatnot. And so, but that is a category. So if you're looking at the census, let's say it'll say racial category. It's a very appropriate term. It's not racial group, because a group has a shared culture, interacts, has an identity dependent on each other. Remember, this is your new sociological thinking. They're not a group, they're a category. So a really neat way that the census actually validates that official sociological language. The next is an aggregate, and this is a group of people that just happen to be in the same place at the same time. Let's say at the mall or at the beach, or sometimes even at a concert, although the concert might, bringing people together because they have sort of a shared purpose and whatnot. But there's not necessarily a relationship that exists between the people. There's just a bunch of people there at the same time. Now, when we look at groups of people getting together, and we're just sort of the dynamics that can happen with that, and we're going to sort of separate those from the organized, goal-oriented practices of social movements, okay? And we have to make sure that we distinguish two. In fact, maybe the best distinction between them we can make is if we looked at Black Lives Matter as a crowd, and simply a crowd, and then we look at the social movement of Black Lives Matter, and those are distinct, even though they may both refer to themselves as BLM. Now, look in this section in terms of theories of crowd behavior when individuals get together. Let's say a number of individuals gather downtown after hearing about an atrocity. There are different ways that we can explain those individuals' behavior that are not social movements. In the first, emergent norm theory, people respond to the crowd experience based on their own norms, but then they start to adopt other norms. So as soon as people start yelling, throwing things, or maybe breaking things, that norm can spread. That's just, you can observe that in crowd behavior. And it's important to recognize that this is somewhat separate from an individual's motivation for being there in the first place. They might not have shown up to do that. But then as the crowd starts to have its own identity, and there's a bit of anonymity associated with their individual practice, they might just follow along with what's going on, and almost like a peer pressure sort of effect. Now, the next one we look at is value-added theory. This is the emerging perception that there's a shared crisis or problem, and everyone has to act right now. This is, we have to do something right now. This shared experience creates a shared identity, and that also leads to crowd behavior. And then there's assembling perspective was we're getting together for a purpose. We're all here. So we see this sort of like the norms become the crowd norms. Then there's like, we need to do something right now. There's an emergent, sort of need for things. And then there's this perspective that we're a group, that there's a shared identity, this assembling perspective, all of which can create the image that this is some sort of organized event. And I don't know whether there are organized violent events, and I would suspect that there are. I would suspect that most of them are not. I'd expect most of the people congregate on the street. They aggregate, let's use that word, on the street, and these social norms start to happen, and pretty soon they're acting in cooperation with each other, accomplishing a task, but they don't represent the social movement, which has very different practices and the way that it wants to go about. So we can kind of, I think the BLM as a aggregate crowd behavior might be distinct, or is distinct, from BLM as a social movement, which everything that I've read about social movement is that there's the social movement of BLM is it closely aligns with Martin Luther King's nonviolent perspective in terms of bringing about social change. It was very successful then. It can be very successful now. But making that distinction between crowd behavior that may develop the identity of BLM, coercive or not, and then the official social movement of BLM that in truth has policies related to more peaceful demonstration. So when we look at social movements, we're social scientists, we categorize everything. So we look at different kinds of movements that are out there, and I want you certainly to go into the textbook and read on these in more detail. There's no reason for me to repeat the definitions, but we have reform movements where people want to make a change to something. They want to change an existing policy, an existing law, and we might see, let's say, pro-life and pro-choice social movements, that those individuals have an agenda to the pro-life, wants to overturn practices and laws related to abortion, and pro-choice want to protect those. So that'd be sort of a reform movement to reform an existing practice. The next is revolutionary. Now, revolutionary movements, they propose, and we think of revolution, we sort of think of big, American, Russian, French revolutions, kinds of things like that. But a revolution can be just a kind of a restart. We're going to take the existing structure, we're going to completely tear it down, and we're going to rebuild that structure. It's a very drastic move. We tend to use revolutionary to label some movements because they happen to be very unique ideas, but that's really not the kind of official use of that. Revolution is really that idea that we're tearing things down and rebuilding them. And as you can see, there have been times in history where that's been necessary, and there's been times in history where we need those flag holders that say, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to throw all this out. Maybe we really want to reform and not revolution. Revolution tends to destroy. There's a kind of a destroying effect of it and then rebuilding, and certainly people can have that perspective. And then there's some that say, well, there are lots of things that are working, let's just keep it to reform. Third kind of movement that we might see is religious movements. And religious movements are interesting because everything in sociology is interesting, but in particular because this is how all the denominations sort of came about. If you look at different denominations throughout the world, you have, even in the ones that we rarely encounter here in the U.S., the Far Eastern faiths and African faiths and stuff like that we may encounter, there's offshoots that will happen where it's almost that sort of a combination of either reform or revolution. You have this main body of faith, and then you have a group that says, I don't believe what we're doing as a group, so we're going to splinter off and create our own. And and so now there are hundreds of denominations, let's say hundreds of Christian denominations. There are different Muslim denominations. There are different Jewish denominations. And as much as I'm not familiar with those religions, I would imagine that there are dozens or so of offshoots of the other major religions that are out there. And these are movements where either we want to start a reinterpretation, let's say, of sacred text, or, as we often might see, is a perception of a going back to tradition, to the original meaning of the text, rather than, that let's say a denomination has begun to, say, modernize, let's say. And there might be some flag holders in there that say, no, we like the original interpretations, we're going to break off and start our own, going like that. Or there might be a group that's, sticking to the traditional ways, and there's a group that breaks off, and these are those speed swimmers, boop, and they go off. And there might be some, shark watchers that go, okay, you guys are going to go and do this, it's going to fail, your church isn't going to work. You see those three roles manifest inside of a church, inside of a religion kind of thing. And we see this manifestation. These are another kind of social movement. And we go into alternative movements. These are, there's an issue. They want to have an issue. Let's say the environmental movement, which is reform, revolutionary, for some even faith-based, but it's providing another perspective. Maybe we should do things this way. The democratic socialist movement would say, hey, wait a minute, maybe we need to clean up the word socialism here, because it's, we live in a mixed economy and it really is going on. And there are some things that work better under a socialist movement. Not everything, but there's some things that work better. Let's say we want to have a single payer medical system because we can do it right and make that happen like we do with Medicare and Medicare. And so those are alternative ideas, and there may be people presenting those alternative ideas. And then finally, resistance movements, and these are resistant to change. So I would imagine we could probably categorize the current movement of resistance against the election of Joe Biden by the followers of Trump as sort of a resistance movement. They don't want to see that change. We're not here to call it legit or not legit, but nonetheless, it would be categorized as a resistant movement. Now, let's be clear that the nice thing about sociology is we don't always have to be thinking about those big things. They scale down to a family or a workplace. We can have all of these going on in our workplace. So we can have reform movements where there might be a group of people in your workplace that want to change a policy about who, how do we rotate on-call status? They want them, and so they get together and organize, and they go through the channels to make that change. There might be revolutionary movements. There might be groups that say, no, I don't want to do this. I'm leaving. You may have family members that have said, no, I don't want to live that way, and they kind of do a revolution. They go and start their own after they failed to, redo the one that's there. Religious movements, you could see this in your church as well as you can see it in society, in the world. Alternative movements, clearly we can see, there might be a group of people in your family or in your maybe some of the, I have been engaged in a reform alternative movement my own about Christmas. I'm trying to reduce the number of presents, kind of focus on the real Christmas idea for me and my family. And I have not been successful at doing that, but certainly I plug away in trying to change, reform the way we do Christmas here in the Kavanaugh household. And then, of course, we can see resistant movements, because I was actually very recently, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, involved in there was a hiring that occurred at KVCC, and there was a group of us that got together, and we were extremely unhappy with the individual that was hired, and it created a movement, and the person no longer works for KVCC. And so that was the person was not qualified to be in their position, and their behavior was clear. So these kinds of things, they all scale. So we can think about movements in a large worldwide sort of scale, and we can also think about them in a very localized, very personal scale. Now, as we look at what the expectations are for this last week, we have a discussion and a quiz. The discussion has you look up the hashtag things, all those hashtags, hashtag BLM, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag no more, hashtag, all the different ones, and kind of discuss them using the language of reform, revolutionary, religious, alternative, and resistive movements, keeping in mind that one movement can be all of those, and keeping in mind that social movements have that sort of organized, we're going through the channels most of the time. And it's separating that, maybe just as a lesson, separating that from the sort of radical things that are going on that are not part of those movements, but yet they get identified with those movements. And in the quiz probably should have been changed because I did add the research paper to this. So and most of you actually did the research paper. So for those of you who did do the service learning, I want you to do a quiz on how what you did is a little or a big part of a social change. For those of you who have done the research paper, I want you to answer the same question. how would your paper, how could it be used to create social change? How could a group that wanted to bring about some sort of movement use your research as a tool to convince others for a social change? That will be a very creative answer. So I'm not really going to be looking for right or wrong. I'm going to be looking for how well you can actually apply the concept of social movement to your research paper. So see if you can get that done. And then that will be it. I'm going to do one more video at the end of class, but I will see you in the discussions and make the best out of this last week. I'll see you soon.